Okay, yes, thank you, Lawrence and Carl and everyone for the invitation. So today I want to kind of flip what we were just talking about and actually think more with you about my research on what I would call avatar therapeutics in ritual and play contexts, including some potential applications to psychiatric practice, specifically via integrating tabletop role-playing games into clinical practice. Okay, so I'll focus on key ideas from my recent book. So I'm going to go through a lot of ideas. If you find some of this interesting, you can read more about it in this full-length monograph. But yeah, this talk I want to sketch based on some of my work both in religious context, but also in gaming context, the basis of an avatar kind of therapeutics and how that might be applicable to some things that psychiatrists think about in clinical practice. My main thinking here is, first I want to talk about some kind of general links between ritual, play, and well-being. And then I want to focus more on my avatars be a kind of source. Like when religious and ritual and religious practices and gaming practices, there's a lot there to unpack. So then the question is, can we isolate more narrowly to this kind of relationship to like what I'm calling an avatar, explain more what that is, might be a source of therapeutic value of some kind. When I think about what I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to summarize like even decades of research grounded in ethnography and trying to show how some of my insights into what I'm calling avatar therapeutics were developed through like ethnographic anthropological research. And so that's really where the insights come from. So then the question is, can we apply that to psychiatry? But for me, I'm not a clinician, so I'm more interested in how we can, draw some kind of close and important connections between like foundational, in this case, ethnographic research and clinical practice. So if I'm going to recommend a kind of, clinical practice, I want it to be grounded in things that I'm learning in some of my field sites, for example. So largely between 2008 to 2016, I was aiming to understand Sahara tribal well-being in context of displacement from a wildlife sanctuary in central India. So these maps locate, you can see the state of India, and this is a wildlife sanctuary, and there are groups that were pushed outside of the wildlife sanctuary and then that remained in the wildlife sanctuary, and I was trying to understand the distress involved in that human displacement, that refugee situation, and also some of the kind of sources of resilience. These slides give you a sense of the social. I'm going to transport you as an ethnographer to some of the places where I work. So these slides give you a sense of some of the social and environmental context of this research of mine. Here's a shot of Tusaharia. This is a tribal group who had been displaced from their homeland in the name of wildlife conservation. And I wanted to understand both the kinds of, that as a kind of source of distress and also some of the sources of resilience that were involved as well. So this shows a fence that separated individuals from their ancestral homes. Here are some Sahara children. Just giving you some context before I move on to some of the substance. Water scarcity is a real problem in this arid region. So gathering water from wells, and this fell largely on the shoulders of women in particular, providing water for the households. Here's one of the villages where I worked. This is actually just outside of the core of the sanctuary in the buffer zone. So here's one of the displaced villages in its original context at the core of the wildlife sanctuary, and then this is in front of a temple in the new village outside the wildlife sanctuary. So in this research, I've been particularly interested to understand how ritual practices and religious commitment might provide sources of well-being and resilience in these situations. So for example, I tracked religious experience and health outcomes for 9 days in Sahara villages in 2 ritual contexts, one during the Hindu festival of Holi, and another during the Hindu festival of Navratri, or the 9 nights of the goddess. And the results showed over these 9 days actually quite dramatic improvement in a number of kinds of outcomes that we used, including like salivary cortisol, so we had some biomarkers, and we were assessing stress, dramatic improvements. We had some standard kind of anxiety and depression scales, improvements, and when I say dramatic, between say 20 to 30% over 9 days, which is, as you know as clinicians, that would be very hard to achieve in a kind of clinical encounter. We also constructed some of our own scales, a scale that I referenced a little bit earlier, called the Positive and Negative Affect Scale, or the PANAF scale, to get into kind of a more culturally salient kind of idiom of distress that we thought, and we think the data showed this was more valid for a number of reasons. I found improved outcomes over the Hindu festival of Holi. That's what I just said. So here's some images of some of those kinds of activities at Holi. Remember, dramatic improvement. So some, suggesting a kind of therapeutic, something therapeutic going on here. But then also in and around these 9 nights of the goddess, the Navratri festival. So these were kinds of very socially intensive kinds of seances that turned into kind of community festivals. So also tracking those rigorously each day over a 9-day period, same kinds of improvements. So these were 2 different villages, one in the kind of remaining near the core of the sanctuary, and then one outside of it. This was a mixed methods ethnographic study with numerous threads, including biomarkers, as I said, and through salivary cortisol, but also medical exams. And we had some local doctors who worked for the state who joined us. And here you can see some of our respondents spitting into these little vials that they actually wanted to keep as souvenirs after we left, because they seemed attached to the project in certain ways. Okay. And then this is all kind of, I'd say, more or less background, but anyway, I'll keep going. Gaming, another set of context here. So I've also been assessing well-being in relationship to gaming, like video games played in so-called gaming zones or gaming lounges. This is in the town of Udaipur, Rajasthan. So here they're also playing Counter-Strike Go, a first-person shooter. So the point here is that some of the benefits, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment, they're in these local kind of intensive kind of gaming relationships that individuals have with these small groups. Some of the tensions also, it's not totally dissimilar from what we just heard in China with their families and so forth. But there's a kind of global identity and connection, being a kind of true gamer, that also serves as a kind of beneficial source, I would say. So to summarize a lot of work and a lot of thinking, the key therapeutic processes, as I understand them, revolve around identity construction. And to frame these results, I've turned to Vivian Vignol's as a kind of heuristic, 6-dimensional, motivated identity framework. And the idea is that there are many bases of identity, and those are some of the important ones. This coincided with a lot of things we were learning over years, and so proved useful. And so we started employing this even more explicitly in our studies. There are many bases of identity, and then contextual, personal, and cultural factors can shape which are pursued in a given individual's life. So for example, from my book, the key frame story is of Badami Bhatt, who was a member of a performing group referred to as the Bhatts, living in Udaipur, Rajasthan. At one point, she became possessed by her husband's clan deity, or deity, or Kul Devi, referred to as Chavdamata, an incarnation of the mother goddess. And as the Devi god, she was an idealized superior self. And as I argue throughout the book, this gave her a new and valued identity as the goddess that helped her mend conflicts between her husband and her family. I can't give you all the details, but that's what happened. So in Vignol's turn, she gained all those kinds of dimensions of identity as this new kind of valorized Devi. She gained self-esteem and a feeling of being able to accomplish her goals. And being the Devi gave her a new language to kind of articulate her identity that seemed quite beneficial to her. And likewise, I was struck by parallels in gaming, where there's similar identity construction themes and that we saw in these Rajasthani ritual contexts, as you can read from these quotes as I'm talking. For example, feeling in Vignol's terms that gamers were also gaining these kinds of feelings of enhanced self-esteem, achievement and efficacy, social connection, and belonging. In fact, gaming provided that kind of language for all these kinds of or a kind of set of behaviors, and also language for articulating all these different kinds of dimensions of identity. We could state this graphically and abstractly, so accounting for other kind of prior kind of causal or confounding factors, ritual and play seem to contribute to well-being through this kind of sense of providing this virtual identity. So I know all you are interested in mental health and stress and anxiety, but for me, the most direct benefits come through these identity pathways that then might be translated into some of these other kind of mental health outcomes. So up to now, I've made some general points about kind of ritual play and identity and well-being. These are questions I've worked on for years, as I said. Ritual can be beneficial in many ways. Maybe in that Vignol's framework, you start to get a little bit of feeling of that, right? But a narrower question, is there something about a feeling of having a deep personal connection with an avatar or a character? And does that personal connection to that idealized self promote well-being? So this is a narrower question that's feeding into some of the interventions that we're thinking about. Is there something about these games and these religious contexts that relates more narratively to what I'm calling avatars? So here I define an avatar as an agent who serves as a vehicle or a vessel for another's consciousness and will. In spirit possession in India, mediums transform into avatars of divine will. Here, for example, we see Vishnu as Krishna in his 8th form. He triumphs over the snake god, for example. But these are all shots of spiritual specialists that I worked with in Rajasthan. This is Badami Bhatt up here in the home where some of her possessions took place. This was at those festivals of Navratri. Here's a woman possessed by some dirty spirits who would go to a Muslim saint referred to as known as Mastana Baba, who would heal her or cure her in some ways. And then likewise in contemporary role-playing games, avatar more commonly are understood to be digital representations of a player in a virtual world. And those characters do players' bidding. So are you the avatar of God, or is the player your avatar? But it's that kind of bond or that personal kind of connection you create with those characters that we think we're starting to see as a kind of basis of some potential important therapeutic mechanisms. Now, you may be asking yourself, why are gaming characters referred to as avatars? You can kind of be reading over that as I'm talking, but there's a kind of interesting, like Silicon Valley kind of history there. In the Hindu religion, avatar is a Sanskrit term. It means literally descent or incarnation. It's like embodying the deity or God. Avatars most typically referred to the material incarnation embodiment of Vishnu as God on earth. So the most famous Hindu avatars are referred to as Vishnu's Dasha Avatara, the 10 incarnations of Vishnu. And he would take these forms, including the form of Krishna, to fight and fight evil and restore kind of cosmic balance. So in 1985, working for George Lucas's LucasArts, Randy Farmer and Chip Morningstar, they created a video game called Habitat, the first attempt at a large-scale commercial graphical virtual world. So this is in the 80s, which is considered the precursor of today's massively multiplayer online role-playing games like World of Warcraft, where some of my research has unfolded. In Habitat, Farmer and Morningstar improvised the notion of avatar to refer to the digital representation of a character, which was the first usage of this, first usage of this term. So Hinduism, like Eastern spirituality, had been popular in California, and Southern California, also in Silicon Valley since the 1960s, closely connected to so-called hippie counterculture. So in their reasoning, just as like heavenly Hindu kind of human avatar, gods embodied in humans to kind of fight evil, in their reasoning, so my video game players, godlike in their powers and scaled down video game worlds, become embodied in technological second self avatars. Okay. So I'm not going to go into this, but if we're trying to, if I or my team, if we're trying to isolate like causal factors that are determined, like is the avatar of the piece is actually driving some of these therapeutic processes, there's some stricter kind of causal, kind of reasoning conditions we have to meet in order to see if that's actually happening. That's important because if we're designing interventions based on some of these principles, we need to do that in order to be convinced that these interventions are going to do what we think they're going to do. Okay, so I have to kind of wrap up here. So this is I'm just going to talk about some pieces here. How do we take all those pieces I just talked about and turn them into a kind of psychiatric intervention? And so if you don't know these, so video games didn't seem as reasonable an option, but tabletop games, for different reasons, this kind of small group dynamics and other reasons, seem to be the kind of way to do this. So we were most interested in how tabletop role-playing games might be conceived as a form of drama therapy of a kind, and how we might conduct research in order to establish if some of these persona or avatar principles might have been working there. So in tabletop role-playing games, if you don't know these games, these are like small groups of 3 to 6 players with a game master, and there's kind of rules and kind of formal systems, and you play a character, right? Drama therapy is a form of psychotherapy where clinicians intentionally employ theatrical processes to promote growth and change in their clients' lives. But in recent years, and it can be distinguished from approaches like psychodrama, with the former relying more on, drama therapy relying more on indirect, symbolic, metaphoric, and imaginative kind of dramatization versus actually kind of enacting kind of processes from your life. So in recent years, there's actually been people who have been working on this and showing that actually employing tabletop role-playing games based on drama principles and seeing kinds of improvements in things like self-esteem, self-efficacy, and so forth. However, they don't really understand the mechanisms involved, and that's where the basic research that that my team has been doing and I've been doing over years. It's like, well, there could be a lot of mechanisms, but maybe some of the mechanisms relate to this kind of relationship you establish with this fictive virtual, character, right? So, there's drama therapy, all these different kinds of techniques, and then kind of abstract principles behind it. But again, we're focusing on, well, what about this relationship to character itself, and developing a certain kind of in-depth kind of, personal relationship to character? Might that be a kind of source of some kind of positive therapeutic goals? But where we're going with this is like, yes, but there are a lot of other contextual cultural factors that a clinician or researchers would have to be aware of for this to really work in the ways that we imagine. I'm not going to go into all this, but this is a new kind of version of the ethnography in a tabletop gaming setting, where we're trying to really focus in now on those relationships that players develop in characters and how that might be connected to helping players develop these kind of positive kinds of virtual identities first, and then a fuller kind of stronger sense of their identity. And then maybe down the line, it's harder to track in a kind of formal study, but there are ways to kind of track that related to kind of reductions in anxiety and stress and other kinds of things. So it's a mixed methods ethnographic study. I can certainly tell you more about that or some of the key constructs that we're using in that study. And loosely we're finding that yes, persona is important, a certain kind of persona that we're calling, and others have called a kind of symbiotic or kind of hybrid relationship. Your character is kind of you and kind of another, in a way taking some of your own traits and also taking some of desired traits from others and fusing them into almost like a better version of yourself, and then being able to enact that in a kind of vibrant, social world and have others see that. That could be part of what is really effective here, and that is kind of the way, at least one way, that some people think that drama therapy might be working. Got 2 more slides here, so I should be able to wrap this up. We're looking at that kind of hybrid or symbiotic relationship you develop with your character and how that could be very important. But when you do the ethnography and you code the interviews, you learn there's a lot of complexity and depth behind how players are actually thinking about and relating to their characters, along with many other dimensions of what the game is what's happening in the game. And there's also a lot of contextual and things that clinicians and researchers have to be aware of. For example, without support and a feeling of safety and trust in the group, you just don't get any benefits. You can't play the character and be vulnerable enough to reveal yourself to the other players and to really inhabit this character in a way that might be beneficial to you. It could only work for certain kinds of players, having a certain kind of absorptive, an interest in games, experience with games, but also maybe a kind of absorptive, imaginative, kind of immersive capacity. If you're going to engage with this as a clinician, you'd probably want to familiarize yourself with the role of a game master and some of the and world building and how does this work, and get involved in some way, and certainly learn a lot about your patients in the process. We don't really know about the cross-cultural applicability of this stuff, though we have collaborators all over the world, throughout Europe and France and Finland and Switzerland, also in Argentina and also in Singapore and China. So we're all kind of trying to build this up, and also thinking about the way that adult play is acceptable or even celebrated in certain cultural contexts, but not in other cultural contexts. And the final slide, I'll just say quite simply, I think you get a sense of this, but I just reiterate, this probably feels different to you. You ask for interdisciplinarity, and so you get an anthropologist. And this is what we talk about, this is what I talk about, but the key here is, rather than just jumping into the therapeutics and the clinical applications, for me, I can't do that. First of all, I'm not a clinician. The key here is establishing those kind of firm links between the kind of foundational ethnographic research and the clinical applications. So thank you.